Technical briefing. The Cascadian Comanche. The Comanche can trace its lineage directly back to the light helicopter experimental program initiated by the U.S. Army in the early 1980s. It's unclear exactly when Boeing helicopters and Sikorsky got together to work on the Comanche. However, for this setting we are going to state that it was some time before the eruption in 1985, and that they had access to all of Sikorsky's design studies that had been snatched up during Operation Paperclip II. How and why these studies ended up in Seattle, in addition to Philadelphia, has been lost to history. Obviously, after Cascadia's secession, joint development would cease. The U.S. could no longer foot the bill for developing a new light helicopter, and as such, all funding that was going to develop a new chopper was diverted into upgrading the Apache, Cobra, and Kiowa. The new Cascadian Air Force found itself in need of an attack helicopter to counter the threat of U.S. armor, especially the upcoming M1A2 Abrams. The Californians had access to some of the plans for the Apache that were looted from the McDonnell Douglas plant in Long Beach. However, it was nowhere near ready to put into production and would require significant reverse engineering. Initially, a tender was made to foreign manufacturers for an off-the-shelf chopper that could be put into service quickly. However, given Cascadia's current status in diplomatic limbo, only the Soviets were willing to offer them helicopters. Even then, Cascadia's request for the then-new Ka-50 or Mi-28 helicopters were both turned down, as the Soviets were unable to get either helicopter operational for themselves at the time, and were instead offered older Mi-35, Mi-25, and Mi-8 TVK gunships. Cascadia offered to lease a small batch of Hinds for 5 years to give themselves time to develop an indigenous helicopter. They gave Boeing a call, who then dusted off Sikorsky's research. There are several distinct differences between the real-world RAH-66 prototypes and the fictitious Cascadian Comanche. The fictitious version did not suffer from feature creep that the real helicopter did, and many of the superfluous requirements added onto the Comanche during its development were not present here. For example, the requirement for the Comanche to be able to fly across the Atlantic would be completely irrelevant in the context of a defense force, and as such, the fictional version doesn't have the option to mount external fuel tanks. The XM301 rotary cannon was scrapped in favor of a simpler single-barrel 20mm chain gun. The engines were built to the same spec as the real helicopter, but were made by a consortium of Rolls-Royce and IHI Corporation. Because of a streamlined development cycle, the prototype flew in 1994, and by 1996, the first operational units were online. Weaponry is similar to the real helicopter, aside from the aforementioned cannon. The Hellfire remains the Comanche's primary offensive ordnance. The missile was developed by Lockheed, then headquartered in CA, during the 70s, so both California and Cascadia would have access to it. Both the Hydra and CRV-7 70mm rockets were used interchangeably, including some guided variants. For air defense, usually the AAM variant of the Bigfoot SAM is carried. However, the Stinger can also be mounted and used. It has been rumored that they can mount either GAU-19 or M134 miniguns in gun pods on the stub wings. However, this has never been observed in practice. Finally, various types of ECM and EW pods can be mounted to the stub wings. The upgraded AH-66B variant was introduced in the mid-2000s. Most of the upgrades were to the aircraft's avionics and sensors. The nose-mounted sensor pod was completely redesigned and replaced. The instrument panels were redesigned, and the older display units with modern high-definition display units. A small radar unit was mounted on top of the main rotor spinner. It was not as large as the longbow radar mounted to the real Comanche. The fairing behind the gun turret was redesigned and likely contained sensors and/or antennas. There were also 2 antenna fairings mounted to the bottom of the horizontal stabilizer, similar to the vertical fins on the real prototypes. The engines were upgraded with a slight power output increase and reduced fuel consumption. The lightweight 3-barrel rotary cannon originally envisioned for the Comanche had been completed. now designated the MC-203. It replaced the older chain gun in the nose turret. External armament remained largely the same. However, the stub wings were modified to carry small quadcopter drones that could be mounted to the underside. The AH-66E is a specialized variant of the Comanche attack helicopter designed for controlling QAH-66 attack drones, along with other types of drones, presumably. It differs from production AH-66A and B attack helicopters in that it has two large fairings along the side of the fuselage in lieu of the weapon bays on the standard helicopter. These fairings likely contain additional hardware and antennas for drone control. However, information is not publicly available. They retain the chin-mounted 20mm cannon turrets from the attack variants for self-defense, but are not known to carry any other armament. Despite this, they do also retain the Comanche's distinctive nose-mounted targeting pods, likely for designating targets to the drones. They also retain two pilot crews, with the pilot in the forward seat likely designated as the drone controller, while the rear pilot flies the helicopter. If the crew structure is the same as the attack variants, both pilots are cross-trained to fulfill both roles and periodically alternate between the two. The rotors, powertrain, and tail section are externally the same as the attack variants, with the exception of two vertical fins mounted below to the tips of the horizontal stabilizer, similar to those mounted to the prototype Comanches. It is speculated that these are antennas of some sort, due to slight differences in the paint finish. There are two blocks of QAH-66 Comanche drones. Block 1 is a small batch, approximate 5 units, that are effectively AH-66As that have had the flight compartment replaced with a smooth fairing. A large camera pod is also installed on the nose, replacing the targeting pod on manned Comanches. The cannon turret remains intact, as do the weapon bays. These units were manufactured in the early 00s after the initial AH-66A production run, and have actually been publicly displayed at several air shows and other events alongside standard Comanches. They were painted flat black until around 2016, when they were painted low-visibility gray. These drones were presented to the public as the pinnacle of Cascadian drone technology, as a form of misinformation. In reality, they were quite advanced for the early 2000s when they were built, but have quickly been outpaced and made obsolete as the UDCS was developed. It is now believed that these drones have been relegated for training purposes and/or possibly test beds for new technology.
Block 2 aircraft entered production around 2011 and are significantly different from the crude AH-66. They have a much lower profile fuselage, with most estimates putting the drones about half a meter shorter in height. The weapons bays and doors have been eliminated, instead replaced by 4 hardpoints on the side of the fuselage. The optional stub wings from the standard Comanche are permanently fixed. Some configurations still have the chin turret fitted. However, the 20mm cannon is usually replaced with either a 50 caliber machine gun or a 40mm grenade launcher. They can also carry switchblade kamikaze drones and/or smaller quadcopter drones on specialized mounts on the stub wings. On some drones, the gun turret is removed and replaced with an additional targeting or optic pod. All variants use a network of 8 small cameras mounted around the fuselage for optical navigation and target acquisition. The rotors, powertrain, empennage, and landing gear all appear to be the same as the Comanche. The AI installed on the Block 2 drones is extremely advanced. Publicly available information lists them as Level 3 automation, which is described as follows. Level 3 drones are capable of identifying targets as friendly or hostile, analyze hostile targets, and determine the best weapon system to engage them, analyze tactical situations, and determine the ideal way to complete objectives, and seek out targets of opportunity, all independently, without control by a human operator. This means that a human controller can program the drone with objectives such as fly to coordinate XXX, loiter and search for hostiles, engage hostiles as required, patrol for 90 minutes or until stores are expended, and return to base. The drone can then launch autonomously and figure out how to complete those objectives on its own.
A typical Comanche formation consists of 3 to 6 QAH-66 drones, an AH-66E, and 2 or 3 AH-66Bs. As previously discussed, Comanche drones are advanced enough that they can operate without a dedicated controller, and they have been seen operating directly with standard AH-66Bs or solo when an AH-66E is not available. Conversely, it is also not uncommon to see an AH-66E and its drones without crewed Comanches escorting. In such cases, the AH-66E will typically stay within the range of friendly air cover. When operating independently, crewed AH-66Bs typically fly in pairs or groups of 3.